The air, the feeling of being somewhere raw and untouched, somewhere the rest of the world can't follow. And for the overwhelming majority of those visits, that's exactly what they get. A hike, a view, a memory they carry home and think about on cold Tuesday nights when the office feels like it's closing in. But every now and then, for a very small number of people, what they find out there on those trails is something that stays with them in a completely different way. Not as a memory they return to with warmth, but as one they spend years trying to put down. Today I want to tell you about 5 of those people. 5 real encounters in 5 different national parks. Each one stranger and more disturbing than the last. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and following the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I post a few times a week over there. Let's begin. Story 1. The Smoky Mountains. He wasn't lost. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee-North Carolina border. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the entire country. More than 12 million people pass through it every year. It sits right on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. It covers more than 500,000 acres, and it contains over 800 miles of maintained trail, which means that at any given moment, on any given trail, you could walk for an entire day and not see a single other person. That's exactly what drew 34-year-old Carrie Holt to the park on a Saturday in mid-October. Carrie was an experienced solo hiker. She'd completed sections of the Appalachian Trail across multiple states. She knew how to read weather, how to manage her pace, how to camp alone without anxiety. She had done this enough times that the backcountry felt like home to her. Not just comfortable, but genuinely familiar, the way a well-worn kitchen feels familiar. That Saturday, she set out before sunrise from the Davenport Gap trailhead with a 2-night permit and a 30-mile section planned. The weather was cold but clear. The leaves were past peak but still on the trees, hanging on in that last gasp way they do in October, orange and brown and gold against a sky so blue it almost looked artificial. She told her sister where she was going and when to expect contact. By 8 in the morning, she'd put 6 miles behind her without seeing another soul. Then she stopped to eat breakfast at a flat rock above a creek crossing, sat down, pulled out her food, and looked back the way she'd come. There was a man on the trail behind her. Now I want you to pay attention here, because I want you to understand something. Seeing another person on the Appalachian Trail is not unusual. Hikers pass each other constantly. The trail is long and shared and social in its own quiet way. Carrie didn't feel alarmed. She noted him the way you note a car in the rearview mirror when you're driving on the highway, registered it, filed it, and moved on. The man didn't reach her position. He stopped maybe 200 yards back, appeared to look at something off-trail, and then sat down on a log. She finished eating, packed up, and kept moving. 45 minutes later, she crested a ridgeline and stopped to check her map. She scanned back down the trail behind her. The man was still there. Still the same distance back, still moving at the same pace she was, maintaining that 200-yard gap with a consistency that was either coincidence or wasn't. She told herself it was coincidence. Lots of hikers maintain the same general speed. Lots of hikers take breaks at the same spots. She picked up her pace slightly and pushed on. By noon, she had put in nearly 15 miles for the day. She stopped at a shelter to eat lunch and fill her water filter at the nearby spring. She spent about 25 minutes at the shelter, long enough to fully rest her feet and give herself a proper meal, the kind of deliberate midday stop she always built into her long days. When she stepped back onto the trail and looked south, the man came around the bend in the trail. Same distance, same pace. And here is where something shifted for Carrie, because for the first time she got a clear look at him. He was tall. He was wearing older gear, nothing new, nothing matching, the kind of mismatched kit that suggests someone who buys things secondhand and packs out of necessity rather than preference. He had a full beard that wasn't the kind you grow on a 2-week hike. It was months long, thick and unkempt, in a way that read as not groomed rather than not shaved. His pack was large and heavily loaded, but it wasn't a branded hiking pack. It looked almost improvised. A canvas bag with external lashing, the kind of thing you'd build if you needed to carry more weight than any commercial pack was designed to hold. She waved at him. He didn't wave back. She later said she couldn't tell whether he'd seen her wave or not. There was nothing in his body language that changed. He was just there, moving at his pace, maintaining his distance, looking ahead at the trail. She started walking again. She pushed hard for the rest of the afternoon, harder than she'd planned, harder than was comfortable. And by 4:30 she reached a lean-to shelter where two other hikers, a couple in their 50s named Dennis and Margot, were already setting up camp. Dennis was boiling water on a camp stove. Margot was arranging her sleeping bag. They looked up when Carrie came in and smiled the way hikers smile at other hikers at the end of a long day. Carrie almost cried when she saw them. She explained what she'd experienced. Dennis and Margot listened without interrupting. Dennis said he'd take first watch. Margot made tea. All three of them went to sleep with the shelter walls at their backs and the trail in front of them. The man never appeared at the shelter. The next morning, Carrie made a decision. She cut her trip short and hiked out. She reported the encounter to a ranger at the Davenport Gap station, gave a physical description, described the pack, described the behavior, the consistent distance, the maintained pace, the lack of acknowledgement. The ranger's reaction was not what she expected. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't tell her she was overreacting or that she'd probably just crossed paths with an eccentric section hiker. He listened carefully, asked her to repeat the description of the pack, and then excused himself to make a phone call. When he came back, his expression was measured and professional. But Carrie said she could tell, the way you can always tell when someone is being careful not to show you something, that what she'd described meant something to him. 2 days later, law enforcement rangers located a campsite roughly 3 miles off trail in a section of the park that had no legal campsites and saw essentially zero visitor traffic. The site was sophisticated, not a tent, but a semi-permanent structure built into a hillside using deadfall timber, tarp material, and salvaged insulation. There was a fire pit with a concealment system built around it to reduce the visible smoke column. There was a cache of food that would have lasted months. The structure had a low profile and had been sited with clear lines of sight to the surrounding terrain, the kind of placement that someone thinks carefully about. And on a flattened section of ground near the entrance to the structure, rangers found a notebook. The notebook contained dates, times, and trail names. It contained physical descriptions of hikers, what they were wearing, what kind of packs they carried, what direction they were traveling. And it contained notes that were, by any reasonable reading, observational records. Information gathered, filed, kept. Carrie's description was in it. The notebook entry for her included the time she had stopped for breakfast, what she appeared to be eating, and one single word written beside it. The word was solo. The man was identified as Marcus Alden, 41 years old, who had been the subject of a federal warrant out of North Carolina for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He had been living in the backcountry of the Great Smoky Mountains for an estimated 4 to 6 months, sustaining himself in that off-trail camp and moving through the park's trail system while making sure never to be fully seen by anyone with authority. He was arrested at a gas station outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee, 11 days after Carrie's report. Carrie told the ranger she had never once felt like she was in danger. She said the whole time she just thought the man was strange, not threatening. She said she hadn't even really been scared, just uneasy in that low-level way that's easy to dismiss. The ranger told her that was probably the right way to feel. And then he told her that she was the 4th person in 8 months to report seeing a man matching that description on backcountry trails in the park. She was just the first one who stopped to report it. Story 2, The Bunker. What was behind the ferns? Olympic National Park, Washington State. Olympic National Park in Washington State contains more ecological diversity than almost any other park in the country. Within its boundaries, you have Pacific coastline, alpine meadow, glacier fields, and temperate rainforest. The Hoh Rainforest receives up to 14 feet of rain per year. The trails there move through a landscape so dense and green that the light that reaches the ground feels filtered, softened and muted, like being underwater. Giant big-leaf maples are covered from root to canopy in thick moss, and the ferns that line the forest floor grow waist-height and higher. sometimes crowding the trail so completely that it feels like walking through a corridor of green walls. It is one of the most beautiful and remote places in the continental United States. It is also extremely easy to disappear in. In early September, two brothers, Joel and Ryan Marsh, ages 28 and 31, drove up from Portland for a 3-day backpacking trip in the Hoh River Valley. They'd been there before. They knew the main corridor trail well and wanted to push further up the valley than they had on previous trips, get into the quieter upper sections where the foot traffic drops off and the forest gets denser. On the second day, about 9 miles in, Ryan noticed something off the trail to his right. Through the ferns, through those dense green walls that line both sides of the path, he caught a glimpse of something dark and angular, something geometric and artificial, something that didn't belong in that landscape. He stopped and pointed it out to Joel. Joel looked and saw it too. They pushed through maybe 15 feet of ferns and found themselves looking at a wooden door set into a hillside. Not a root cellar door left from some long-abandoned homestead. Not a storage hatch for trail crew equipment. A door, rough-cut timber, reinforced with metal strapping, set into a frame that had been carefully fitted into the contour of the hillside so that it was nearly invisible from the trail. The hinges had been greased recently enough that there was no rust, no seizing. This was a maintained door. Someone was keeping it in working order. The door was closed but not locked. Joel and Ryan stood there for a long minute, neither of them saying much. They told each other later that neither of them wanted to be the first one to open it. Eventually Ryan did, because he's the older brother and felt like that meant something in the moment. The interior was dug into the hillside, maybe 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, with enough headroom to stand in. There was a cot, a small camp stove with fuel canisters stacked in a careful, not being recorded to any visible media. There were no drives, no cards in sight. It was just live. Someone, somewhere, had sat in that hillside room and watched a screen showing this trail. Watched hikers pass. Watched them the way you watch traffic through a window. From a position of complete invisibility, complete safety, knowing you will never be seen. The brothers stepped out, did not close the door, walked back to the trail, and moved fast. They didn't discuss what they'd found until they were standing in the trailhead parking lot almost 3 hours later. The car doors open, the ordinary world of pavement and cell signal around them. They filed a report with the Olympic National Park Visitor Center the following morning. Rangers and law enforcement reached the structure within 48 hours. What the full investigation revealed took considerably longer. The bunker, which is what investigators called it in the subsequent report, had been constructed incrementally, based on the quantity of material, the complexity of the earthwork, and the staging of the components. Investigators believed it had taken the better part of a summer to build, completed over multiple separate trips, rather than a single extended stay. This wasn't someone who had hiked in one day and started digging. This was a project, a plan carried out over months, piece by piece, load by load. The camera system was more sophisticated than the brothers had realized in the moment. 4 cameras total, positioned at points along a 1-mile stretch of the main trail, each one camouflaged at ground level in the fern cover on the trail margins. The system had been operational based on battery charge levels, component wear, and the condition of the wiring for approximately 8 months. 8 months during which hundreds of people, families, solo hikers, guided tour groups, trail runners, people who drove up from Portland or Seattle for a weekend in the Hoh, had walked past those cameras without knowing. What investigators did not find was any recording media. No hard drives, no memory cards. The footage, if it had ever been saved, had been removed. There was no way to know what had been captured, what had been kept, what someone might still have on a drive somewhere. The structure was linked to a man named Gerald Forsyth, 53, through tool receipts found at his property, tire tracks near a seldom-used forest road that connected to the park boundary, and a partial fingerprint on one of the camera housings. Forsyth was a former security contractor. He had no prior criminal record. He was charged with installation of surveillance equipment in a federal protected area, criminal trespass, and several related federal offenses. During his interview with investigators, Forsyth said, He had never physically approached or contacted any hiker. He said he had never intended to harm anyone. He said he had built the structure and the camera system because, and this is his exact phrasing, documented in the investigative record, he was studying people when they think no one's watching. The cameras were removed. The structure was collapsed and the hillside was restored. The investigation did not turn up any evidence of what had been captured or stored during those 8 months of operation. No recordings were ever found. Joel told a reporter afterward that the worst part wasn't the structure itself, or the cameras, or the fact that someone had spent months building a hidden room in a national park. He said the worst part was the moment on the screen when he recognized the specific stretch of trail they'd been walking 20 minutes before, and understood that they had been on those cameras and never known it. That at some point on the walk in, their image had been on one of those screens, and that if Ryan hadn't looked through the ferns, they would have walked back out the same way, and they still never would have known. Story 3: The Offer. Help. Glacier National Park, Montana. Glacier National Park sits in the northwest corner of Montana, right up against the Canadian border. It's a big park, more than 1 million acres, and its backcountry is genuinely remote in a way that goes beyond most people's understanding of that word. You can hike for multiple days in Glacier's interior and not cross a road. The park sees far less foot traffic than parks like Yosemite or the Smokies, which means the trails go quiet fast. Within a few miles of most trailheads, the solitude becomes complete. There is no one coming. There is no service. There is just the mountain and the sky and you. For most people, that's exactly the appeal. In late July, a man named Paul Chen, 26, set out on a solo backpacking trip along the Highline Trail, one of Glacier's most celebrated routes, running along the Continental Divide above the Going to the Sun Road. Paul was in excellent physical condition. He ran half marathons on weekends. He had done backcountry trips in Colorado and Utah. He was carrying modern, well-maintained gear, a comprehensive first aid kit, and a satellite communicator. One of those handheld devices that lets you send GPS coordinates and emergency signals, even when you have no cell reception, which in most of Glacier's backcountry is all the time. On the second afternoon of his trip, about 14 miles from the nearest trailhead, Paul's right ankle gave out. Not a break. A serious sprain, the kind where the joint rolls completely on loose shale, and you feel the ligaments stretch in a way that makes your stomach turn over before the pain even arrives. He went down hard on a section of exposed rock. He sat up, took stock, and understood immediately that his trip was over. He wasn't going to be covering miles on this ankle. He needed to rest it, stabilize it, and then move slowly toward the nearest exit point when he was able. He got off the trail, found a flat spot in a small stand of subalpine firs, wrapped the ankle from his kit, and made camp. His plan was to rest through the afternoon and evening, then move at first light when the swelling had stabilized. He had food, he had water, he had the communicator if things deteriorated. He was in real pain, and genuinely frustrated, but he was not in danger. That was at around 3 in the afternoon. At roughly 5:30, a man appeared at the edge of the trees. Paul saw him before the man saw him. The man was not on the trail. He was moving through the trees from a direction that had no trail and no logical approach. Not the kind of angle someone takes if they've come from the High Line or any connecting route. He was moving slowly, looking at the ground, the way someone does when they're checking terrain or following something only they can see. Then he looked up and saw Paul. He smiled. He raised a hand in greeting, relaxed and unhurried. He came over and crouched down at a friendly distance. He introduced himself as Warren. He was somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s. Paul was never certain of his age. With a deep outdoor tan, the kind that doesn't come from a 2-week vacation, but from months of continuous sun and weather. His clothing was functional, but worn in ways that spoke to extended use. He said he was hiking through and had noticed Paul's camp. Then he said he was a wilderness EMT and offered to take a look at the ankle. Paul was in pain, and if he was being honest with himself, relieved to have company. He said it was a grade 2 sprain, he thought. Warren crouched closer, examined it without touching it, and nodded with the careful confidence of someone who had seen injuries and knew how to manage them. Then Warren said something that Paul would return to many times in the weeks and months after. turning it over and examining it the way you examine something you know matters, but can't yet fully explain. He said that the trail Paul was planning to use to exit the park was a long way from his current position, and that Paul wasn't going to cover that distance on this ankle in anything less than 3 days of slow going, but that Warren knew a shorter route, a game trail, essentially, not on any official map, that would cut the distance to the nearest road down to less than 8 miles. He said they could travel it together, that he would help Paul move, that they could leave right now before the light went. Paul said he'd think about it. He said it calmly, just buying himself time. And here's the part of the story I want you to sit with for a moment. Paul was not a suspicious person by nature. He was sociable and trusting. He liked meeting people on trails. He was also in genuine pain, in a remote location, with a legitimate need for help. Every logical part of the situation pointed toward accepting the offer. Warren seemed competent, calm, and knowledgeable. The offer was specific and practical, but something in Paul would not settle. He examined it afterward and could never reduce it to one specific thing. It was the angle Warren had come from, not the trail. It was the speed of the offer, how quickly it came before any real conversation had happened between them. It was the specificity, not just, I know a shorter way out, but the exact mileage, the confident dismissal of the official route, the insistence that they should go now, before dark. It was the fact that in the course of the conversation, Warren had never once mentioned where he'd come from or where he was going. Paul told Warren he was going to check in with his contact first, and he held up the communicator. Warren's expression didn't shift, but he stood up from his crouch, that quick, quiet movement from settled to standing. He said Paul didn't need to do that. He said he'd been through this section of the park a dozen times and knew it better than the rangers. He said the communicator was for emergencies, and this wasn't an emergency. He said it with a lightness, almost a smile, the way someone talks when they want to sound reasonable. Paul activated the communicator anyway, not the SOS, just the check-in function, which sent his GPS coordinates to a contact list. His sister, a friend. Warren watched him do it without speaking. Then Warren said the offer stood if Paul changed his mind. He said he was going to make camp nearby. He turned and walked back into the trees, in the exact same direction he had come from. Paul did not sleep that night. He heard nothing, no fire, no movement through the underbrush, no sounds from wherever Warren was supposedly camping. Complete silence from the trees. He sat with his back against the trunk of a fir, and his folding knife open in his hand, and waited for the sky to go from black to gray. At first light, he taped his ankle as tightly as he could manage, loaded his pack, and moved. He covered the miles on that ankle. It took him 11 hours. A ranger at the Granite Park Chalet trailhead walked the last 2 miles out with him. He filed an incident report. Glacier Rangers searched the area where Paul had camped and the direction from which Warren had appeared. They found a camp approximately 1 mile off-trail in a dense section of subalpine timber. The camp had been occupied for an extended period, weeks at minimum, based on fire ash accumulation, the depth of ground compression under the sleeping area, and the quantity and variety of food stores. There was no tent, but there was a carefully constructed sleeping setup using cut boughs and a waterproofed fly rigged between 2 trees. The camp had been built by someone who understood the backcountry and knew how to be comfortable in it without being visible from any trail or ridge. The camp appeared to have been abandoned quickly, recently. The investigation that followed did not turn up a confirmed identity for Warren. His physical description was cross-referenced against missing persons reports, outstanding warrants in Montana and neighboring states, and a list of individuals who had registered to enter the park without any record of exiting. There were several partial matches. No confirmed identification was ever publicly released. What the investigation did establish, what rangers were able to reconstruct from the terrain and from Paul's detailed account of Warren's directional description of the shortcut, was that the route Warren had proposed did not lead to a road. Based on the bearing and the terrain features Warren had referenced, the route led further into the backcountry, away from any trailhead, away from any road, away from any other person. Paul said in his report that he believed Warren had expected him not to have the communicator, that the offer had been calibrated for someone without one. someone who was alone and injured and had no way to tell anyone where they were going. Whether that's exactly right, nobody can confirm. What is confirmed is that Warren had been living in those mountains for weeks, outside any legal permit, without registering with the park, without any contact with any other known person, and that for one afternoon in late July, he'd had a seriously injured, completely isolated person sitting directly in front of him with no easy way out. Warren was never found. The camp was never reoccupied. Story 4: The Compound. Running into it. Zion National Park, Utah. Zion National Park in southwest Utah draws more than 4 million visitors a year, and the overwhelming majority of them stay in the canyon, the main valley, crowded and gorgeous and accessible by shuttle bus, with its famous walls of red and white sandstone rising thousands of feet on both sides. The canyon is the park for most people. It's what they came to see, and it delivers. But Zion extends far beyond the canyon. The east side of the park, the mesa tops, the backcountry, the slick rock desert that stretches away from the canyon rim, might as well be a different place. It is vast and empty and red and completely without services. Trails become suggestions. The terrain becomes abstract. 4 million visitors a year, and most of them never set foot in any of it. 30-year-old Dana Reyes was a competitive trail runner who used national parks as training ground whenever her schedule allowed. She was comfortable moving fast alone in technical terrain. In early May, she drove up from Las Vegas on a Friday morning, parked at the east entrance trailhead, and set out on a 10-mile circuit across the mesa top, a route she designed herself using topo maps and satellite imagery, the kind of thing serious trail runners do when they want to push their route finding alongside their fitness. 6 miles in, she left the marked trail, not because she was lost, because she wanted to scout a specific section of bench terrain she'd identified on a satellite map, a natural shelf that she thought might make a good extension to the circuit on a future run. The bench was maybe a mile off the established trail, easy navigation across open slick rock. She was planning an out and back of 20 minutes or so, and then back to the main route. She crested a sandstone ridge and dropped into a shallow canyon below the bench, and stopped moving. At the base of the canyon, built hard against the far wall where the sandstone overhang provided partial roof cover, and partially hidden under a camouflage tarp anchored with rocks and rebar stakes, was a structure. Not a tent. Not a vehicle left in the backcountry. A structure. A wooden frame with corrugated metal roof sections, walls made from a combination of plywood and sandbags on the windward side. It was roughly the size of a garden shed, solid, built to last through multiple seasons of desert weather. Beside it, arranged in a careful grid on the canyon floor, were plastic storage containers, the large, hard-sided weatherproof kind, at least 20 of them. More possibly if some were inside the structure. And beside those, a rainwater collection system made from PVC pipe routing runoff from the overhang into a sealed drum, and a small solar panel array positioned on the south-facing wall of the canyon for maximum exposure. Dana stood at the top of the drop for a long moment and looked at all of it. This was not the work of a weekend. This was not someone who had hauled a few things out here and set up a rough camp. Every element of that setup, the structural frame, the sandbag walls, the organized containers, the water collection, the power system, had been planned and built and stocked over a period of time that she could not immediately calculate, but understood instinctively was months. Someone had made trips out here, again and again, carrying materials in on their back or on pack animals, building this thing piece by piece in a canyon that no one ever came to. She took out her phone, no cell signal, which she had expected, but she took photographs of everything she could see from her position on the ridge. The structure, the containers, the tarp, the solar panels. She documented it quickly and thoroughly. She was about to turn and head back the way she'd come when the tarp over the structure's entrance moved. A man stepped out into the canyon. He was heavy-set, wearing work clothes, canvas pants, a long-sleeve work shirt, with a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana around his neck. The clothes of someone who worked outdoors, not someone who hiked. He came out into the sun, and then he looked up the slope. He saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. She was above him on the ridge. He was below her in the canyon. The distance between them was maybe 60 feet of steep sandstone. Then the man reached back through the tarp entrance without taking his eyes off her, and when his hand came back out, it was holding a rifle. He didn't raise it. He held it at his side, barrel toward the ground, in the easy and practiced way of someone for whom carrying a rifle is ordinary. But he was holding it, and she was looking at it, and both of them knew it was there. He called up to her and asked what she was doing out here. He said this was private land. Zion National Park is not private land. There is no private land within the boundaries of Zion National Park. Dana told him she was trail running, that she had come off the main trail to scout terrain, and that she was heading back right now. She kept her voice flat and calm and unhurried. She made a decision in that moment. She described it later as an explicit, conscious choice. Not to run, not to move fast, not to give any signal of alarm. She would move like someone who had nothing to worry about, and therefore wasn't worried. She turned and walked back up over the ridge. The moment the crest of the ridge was between her and the canyon, she ran. She ran the full mile back to the established trail at a pace she said she could never have sustained in any normal training context. She ran the remaining 4 miles to the trailhead at the same pace. She got in her car, drove to the Zion Visitor Center, and reported what she'd seen. She had the photographs to show them. Law enforcement rangers reached the site the following morning in force. The man was still there. He had not left. He was sitting outside the structure with his hands visible when the rangers arrived, and he did not resist. His name was Frank Dumont, 58 years old. He had been living in that canyon in Zion National Park for, based on the food stores remaining, the wear on the equipment, the accumulated fire ash, and his own eventual admission, 11 months. He had made his initial supply runs before the structure was finished, packing materials in at night, using a route that approached the park boundary from BLM land to the east, and avoided every staffed trailhead in the area. He had researched the patrol patterns. He had chosen this particular canyon because satellite imagery showed it had no trail access, and because the overhang concealed it from any aerial observation. He had thought about this for a long time before he did it. The structure contained many things: personal gear, tools, food, the infrastructure of an extended wilderness stay. But it also contained a journal, and the journal was the element of the investigation that investigators found most significant. Dumont had been conducting surveillance on park visitors, not from a hidden camera system, from the canyon rim, above a section of trail visible from his position, using binoculars. The journal contained entries spanning months, documenting specific hikers, clothing descriptions, group composition, the time they passed, the direction they were moving. Some entries included crude but recognizable sketched profiles of faces. He had been watching people who had no idea they were being watched, from a position they had no reason to look at, and he had written down what he saw. Alongside the surveillance entries, the journal contained extended writing about the park, about what Dumont described in increasingly intense language as the desecration of the wilderness by mass tourism, by federal management, by the kind of people who came to Zion to take photographs and then left. The writing grew harder and more hostile as the months went on. The entries from the final weeks before his arrest, according to the investigators who reviewed them, had reached a level of intensity that was concerning in ways that went beyond the legal offenses. Frank Dumont had never physically approached a visitor. He had never left the canyon where his structure was. There was no evidence, in the journal or anywhere else, of any planned action beyond observation. But he had watched. For 11 months he had sat above that trail with his binoculars and his notebook, and he had watched. And he had been 3 months away from another full year of it, when Dana Reyes ran off the marked trail to scout some terrain. Dumont was charged with illegal occupation of federal land, possession of a firearm in a national park, and multiple related offenses. He eventually pled guilty and received a sentence that included a permanent ban from all federal lands. The structure was removed. The journal was retained as evidence. Dana said the detail that stayed with her, long after the encounter itself had faded to something she could think about without her heart rate climbing, was the storage containers. 20 of them, at minimum, organized in that careful grid, each one stocked and sealed. each one representing a trip out here in the dark, carrying a load that no one was supposed to see. That level of effort wasn't someone who had broken from reality and wandered into the desert. That was someone who had decided to be there, who had thought it through and committed to it, step by step, over months, before he ever set foot in the canyon. The planning was what disturbed her, the patience of it. Story 5. The Hut. Shelter from the storm. Denali National Park and Preserve, Alaska. Denali National Park in central Alaska is 6 million acres. To put that in perspective, that is larger than the entire state of New Hampshire. It has one road, a single gravel corridor that runs 92 miles into the park's interior, and beyond the first 15 miles of that road, private vehicles are not permitted. You take a bus, or you go on foot. There are no maintained backcountry trails in Denali, none. You navigate by topographic map and by judgment and by reading the land in front of you. The park sees fewer than 600,000 visitors per year, and of those, only a small fraction ever leave the road corridor and go into the backcountry. The ones who do go in understand something before they set foot in it. They understand that this place will not forgive mistakes, that a wrong read of the weather, a bad river crossing, an injury at the wrong moment, any of these things, in Denali's interior, can become the last mistake someone makes. This is not hyperbole. This is the documented history of the park. In early August, a group of 4 backcountry hikers set out on an 8-day traverse in Denali's eastern wilderness. 2 married couples, the Reiners and the Fords, all from Anchorage, who had planned this trip for more than a year. All 4 of them were experienced Alaska outdoors people. Between the 4 of them, they had decades of backcountry travel in the state. They were carrying appropriate gear for the conditions, bare canisters for all food, satellite phones, and a detailed float plan filed with the park, which meant that rangers knew their intended route, their timeline, and what to do if they didn't check in on schedule. These were not people who made avoidable mistakes. On the 4th day, a weather system moved into the area that the forecast had not predicted. In the Alaskan interior in August, weather can change with very little warning. A clear morning can turn to zero visibility conditions within a few hours, and when the change is serious, it is serious fast. What came in that afternoon was a strong low-pressure system bringing sustained winds above 40 miles per hour and driving rain that was cold enough, at that elevation and in that wind, to carry genuine hypothermia risk if they stayed out in it. They were 3 miles from a marked emergency shelter, a ranger-maintained hut, documented on their topo maps, designed for exactly this kind of situation. Basic structure, 4 walls, a roof, a small iron stove, emergency supplies. The door is always left unlocked. That's the point of it. It's there for people who need it. They moved toward it as fast as the terrain allowed. They reached the hut at around 7 in the evening. The door was unlocked as expected. Mark Reiner pushed it open, and the group came inside out of the rain and wind. And for a moment all 4 of them just stood there breathing, grateful for the walls and the roof and the stillness. Then the first thing registered. It was warm in the hut, not the immediate warmth of their own body heat after coming in from the cold, warm from before they'd arrived. The small iron stove in the corner was not burning, but the metal of it was still warm to the touch. Someone had had a fire in it recently, within the past hour or 2 at most. They looked around the hut more carefully. The basic emergency equipment was present. The bunks, the first aid kit bolted to the wall, the emergency rations, but there was considerably more than that. A wooden shelf had been attached to the rear wall, attached with screws driven into the structure, not a portable addition, holding a personal food supply. Not emergency rations, but a varied, organized selection of food that included fresh vegetables wrapped in cloth to keep them from bruising. A sleeping system on one of the bunks that was far more elaborate than anything the shelter was equipped with. A full multi-layer sleep setup with a personal pillow, personal clothing hanging on a cord strung between 2 wall hooks, and on the bunk beside the sleeping setup, a stack of handwritten pages, face up, covered in dense and close-packed handwriting that none of them read more than a few words of before looking away. And on the wall above the shelf, tacked directly into the wood with finishing nails arranged in rows, were photographs. Photographs of Denali's landscape. The ridgelines, the river bars, the tundra, the peaks. Beautiful photographs, taken from positions across the park that suggested someone who had been moving through the backcountry extensively, over a long time, over many trips. These were not tourist photographs. These were the photographs of someone who knew this place. Mixed among the landscape photographs were photographs of the road corridor, the park entrance, the bus stop where visitors boarded the Denali buses at the beginning of their trips, standing in small groups with their day packs, looking up at the mountains, the particular posture of people seeing something for the first time. And in some of those photographs, the visitors were close enough to the camera that their faces were clearly visible. The group locked the door of the hut. They did not use the stove, even though they were cold and wet and the stove was right there. They ate cold food from their own packs, kept their headlamps off after the first few minutes, and organized themselves in shifts, 2 awake, 2 resting, rotating through the night. The wind continued. The rain continued. No one slept who wasn't supposed to be sleeping, and even then, not well. At 3 a.m, during Mark Reiner's watch, there was movement outside the hut. Footsteps in the wet ground close to the door, clear and distinct even over the sound of the wind, coming from the side of the hut, and then stopping at the door. A pause of perhaps 30 seconds, then a knock. 3 deliberate knocks on the wooden door of the hut. Mark woke the others. All 4 of them moved to the far end of the small space, backs against the rear wall, as far from the door as the hut allowed, which wasn't far. Mark had bear spray in his hand. His wife had the satellite phone in hers, with the emergency services number already entered. A voice from outside. Not raised, not aggressive. Conversational in tone, which was somehow worse than if it had been threatening. The voice said, "I know you're in there. The light came on under the door when you came in." The group said nothing. The voice said, "That's my shelter. I built those shelves. I'd like to come inside." A long silence, during which none of the 4 moved or spoke. Then the voice said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want my things." Mark Reiner spoke through the door without touching it. He said they were sheltering from the storm. He said they had a satellite phone and were in contact with park rangers. He said he was going to make a call. The voice outside went quiet. Mark Reiner dialed the backcountry emergency line. The ranger on duty kept him on an open line, asking questions, keeping track, while a law enforcement ranger was dispatched. Given where they were in the park's interior, the response time was what it was. The ranger on the phone told Mark to keep the door locked and to stay calm and to keep talking to him. Mark stayed on that phone for the rest of the night. When the law enforcement ranger arrived at the hut shortly after 5 a.m, the man outside the door was still there. He was sitting against the exterior wall of the hut with his knees drawn up to his chest, in the rain, in the wind, apparently having sat there through the entire night without leaving. He had waited. He did not run when the ranger's light found him. He did not resist. His name was Thomas Greer. He was 44 years old. He had worked as a backcountry guide in Alaska for more than a decade before his license was revoked following a series of escalating incidents with clients and outfitting companies. After that, based on the timeline that investigators and his family later reconstructed, he had effectively vanished. He had stopped contacting his family in the previous October. It was now August. He had been in the Denali backcountry for an estimated 9 months, through a full Alaskan winter, through temperatures that in January and February would have regularly reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. 9 months in the wilderness, using the emergency hut as his base, moving through the park's interior, photographing the landscape and the visitors at the road corridor, writing those dense pages. The pages, all of them, the entire stack, were collected and reviewed by investigators, and later by the psychologists who evaluated Thomas Greer. The writing concerned the park. It concerned what Greer believed was being done to the wilderness by tourism, by federal management, by the visitors who came through on buses and left. The writing framed the park's protection in terms that became increasingly religious in character over the months. The wilderness as something sacred, himself as something appointed to guard it. The entries from the final months described the visitors at the bus stop in terms that went far beyond observation. There was no evidence that Thomas Greer had ever physically approached a visitor. There was no evidence of any planned or attempted physical harm. But 9 months alone in the Alaskan interior, in that cold, in that isolation, in that particular progression of thought, the psychologists who evaluated him concluded that he had experienced what they described as a complete and sustained break from baseline reality. The beliefs in those pages were not the beliefs of a person who was troubled. They were the beliefs of a person who was, in a clinical sense, no longer in contact with the world as it existed. He was removed from the park by float plane. He was evaluated, committed to a treatment facility, and was never permitted to return to Denali. His belongings were removed from the hut and documented. The photographs were retained by Park Service investigators. The handwritten pages were retained as well, and sealed. No one who reviewed those pages has ever described their contents in any public detail. Looking up at the mountains, completely at ease. No reason in the world to look back. Taken from close enough that their faces were clear. Taken by someone who had been there, among them, or very near them, without their knowledge. That was the moment, Mark said, that he understood what had been happening in this park, and for how long. That was the moment the hut stopped feeling like shelter. 5 stories, 5 parks, 5 encounters that the people who lived through them will spend the rest of their lives carrying in one way or another. And I want to be careful here, because I mean this sincerely. The national parks of this country are extraordinary places. They are worth visiting. They are worth protecting. The overwhelming probability, if you step onto any trail in any of these parks tomorrow, is that what you'll find is exactly what you came for. Open air, real silence, beauty that doesn't ask anything from you, and room to think thoughts you can't think anywhere else. But the wilderness does something to the margins. It creates isolation where strange decisions happen. It shelters people who need to be unseen. It is big enough and indifferent enough that it keeps its secrets without any effort at all. And the people inside it sometimes keep secrets of their own. Every now and then the trail takes you somewhere you weren't expecting. That's it for today. If this is the kind of videos you want more of, subscribe. I put these out every week. And don't forget to check out the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.